Nike Incorporated is a multinational Fortune 500 company located in Beaverton, Oregon, and is one of the largest suppliers of athletic footwear, apparel, and sports equipment. In the 2012 fiscal year, Nike made more than $24.1 billion in revenue and employed more than 44,000 people, not even including those who work for the contracted production companies overseas. The Nike brand alone is valued at $10.7 billion, making it the most valuable brand among sports businesses. Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman founded Nike in 1964, originally known as Blue Ribbon Sports, when Knight was a track athlete at the University of Oregon and Bowerman was his coach. The company began with Bowerman's quest for lighter, more durable racing shoes for his Oregon runners. Importing and reselling Onitsuka Tiger shoes from Japan temporarily fulfilled this quest for better running shoes. But Bowerman and Knight dreamed of way more. By 1971, Blue Ribbon Sports was ready to launch its own line of footwear, boasting what would become the trademark Nike swoosh. The name Nike, which is the name of the winged goddess of victory in Greek mythology, replaced the name Blue Ribbon Sports in the late 1970s, and the powerhouse athletic brand we all know today was born. Though millions of people wear Nike shoes on a daily basis, including me, Nike's tremendous success was not without some serious problems. Much like many other corporate giants, Nike has struggled to maintain ethical business practices, particularly working conditions in factories. In this project, I will be exploring the history of Nike's corporate responsibility, examining some key human rights abuse accusations, and hopefully showing the progress that Nike has made. First, let us begin by discussing more about Nike's manufacturing history and the onset of criticism of their business practices. For the most part, Nike products have always been made overseas, mainly in Asia, for two big reasons. The first is, obviously, that the clothes and shoes could be produced for a fraction of the price overseas as they could be domestically. And second is the sheer number of people that Nike could have access to in Asia. In a speech Chairman Phil Knight gave in 1998, he revealed that if the same manufacturing techniques were used in American factories rather than factories overseas, the average cost at retail for a pair of Nike shoes would go up by $100. Nike started their overseas production in 1972 in South Korea and Taiwan by contracting production to local companies rather than owning the plants themselves. Phil Knight was quoted saying, "There is not value in making things anymore. The value is added by careful research, by innovation, and by marketing." Since then, Nike has established contracts with production companies in China, Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia, and a significant amount of Nike's products are manufactured overseas. The factories that Nike contracts with to manufacture employ more than 1 million people, 67% of which are women with an average age of 31 years. There was little trouble or outcry with Nike manufacturing, or manufacturing really in general, prior to the 1990s. Maria Idle made the point that before the human and labor rights activists' outcry against Nike in the mid-1900s, the idea of health and safety regulations and maintaining factory standards abroad was foreign. According to Ms. Idle, when the reports of human rights violations that were committed in Nike factories overseas were released, is when the company realized that there was even an issue to be raised. During this time, many reports were being released about the ethicality of Nike's manufacturing process, and the company was receiving constant criticism from a variety of human rights groups, labor activists, and pretty much every major media outlet. The accusations ranged from extremely low wages to the point where workers were struggling to survive, unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, arbitrary hiring and firing of workers, to criticism about jobs being taken away from American workers. Perhaps the two largest critiques that the public latched onto were wages and child labor. Studies done around this time show that Nike factories in Asia and other foreign contracted factories paid the average worker $35 a month, significantly more than the state-owned factories in the same areas. However, the average worker in said factory would have to work 60 to 80-hour weeks, which would bring the wage to about 10 to 15 cents an hour. And although there was supposedly an age restriction for workers, there were reports that came out of 12-year-olds working in Nike contracted factories in Cambodia. Following the release of the factory reports and the brutal criticism, public protests and boycotts against Nike began. The protests took shape in a few main ways. One would be picketing outside flagship stores around the country, and the second being students pressuring their universities into canceling apparel contracts with Nike. While some sources claim that the boycotts were very successful and a driving force behind Nike's 50% decrease in stock price in 1998, the boycotts may not really have been that successful. The decrease in stock price and revenue was likely also seriously affected by the Asian financial crisis that led to a serious plunge in the Dow Jones in the late part of 1997. While the idea of protesting Nike may have been a good one, many would argue that the protests and boycotts directly affected the people that Nike was supposedly already abusing. Critics pushed the idea that the fight for higher wages would force Nike to cut costs by laying off workers, which could be detrimental because of the few other employment options available. So clearly, Nike had a serious problem on their hands. The public wasn't really happy, and it was clear that there was a need for reform, not just among Nike factories, but among all factories overseas. And beyond the public's outcry against the company, Miss Idle reminded me how the Nike employees in the United States were also deeply affected by the criticism. Nike's first response to the onslaught of immense criticism was to ignore that there were any problems in its subcontracted factories in Asia. However, the anti-Nike activists used Nike's denial to embarrass the company even more, and the executives at Nike quickly figured out that serious action needed to be taken. Even CEO Phil Knight himself admitted that the Nike name had become, quote, synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. And another direct quote from the Sweatshop Agreement says, "What Nike primarily sells is its image. For Nike to have its image associated with sweatshops in Asia was more than an embarrassment. The revelations threatened sales." There were a few key steps that Nike initially took to combat the extreme public berating. The first and perhaps most important step that Nike took was to implement internal auditing programs and to hire external ones to verify that violations of conduct in factories were limited. The most famous external audit, likely because a human rights group leaked it early, was the audit by Ernst & Young in 1997. The report that Ernst & Young prepared noted a serious lack of ventilation, proper protective equipment, and excess overtime hours. The other main steps that Nike took were largely a result of this report. Nike pledged to eliminate the use of a toxic adhesive called toluene that caused serious harm to the workers when they were not protected, and to raise the minimum age for an employee in a footwear factory to 18 and apparel and equipment to 16. The other significant response that Nike had was to hire someone to take on the future of Nike's corporate responsibility. Cue Maria Idle. You might think she was pretty crazy for accepting the post of vice president of corporate responsibility at a time when it seemed like pretty much everyone hated Nike. She was brave enough to accept the risky position, knowing how much of a difference she could make. Idle was pivotal in creating and implementing Nike's first corporate responsibility agenda, a key part of Nike's corporate responsibility plan still today, and in her time as vice president, Nike, quote, established an environmental sustainability policy and initiatives targeted to give 3% of the company's pre-tax income, or about $37.3 million in cash, to communities around the globe, developed an internal and external contract factory monitoring program, and drove greater integration of corporate responsibility into the business. Idle credited a lot of her success to the company itself, however, insisting that it was tremendously supportive of her team's ideas. She said she never received no for one of her plans. Since the initial uproar against the company, Nike has experimented with different techniques on how to handle their corporate responsibility. From initially only viewing the situation as a reputational problem and taking the approach of, quote, risk mitigation, to realizing the need to address the more profound systemic causes of the public dissent in the 1990s and the importance of transparency and collaboration. Today, Nike has a clear focus on public reporting and a willingness to release information about its factories. It releases a yearly and quite lengthy corporate responsibility report that outlines business strategy, manufacturing, and impact areas like labor, waste, community, and climate. From the company's recent corporate responsibility report, I think Nike has consolidated its action plan into a few major points. 1. to define what good looks like in manufacturing with a single evaluation system to test all factories that supply Nike, called the Manufacturing Index, and 2, Human Resources Management Training, which is basically a program to provide training and support to factory managers so that they can have the skills to maintain Nike's labor requirements, and 3, to collaborate with civil society and governments to continue positive change in the manufacturing industry, from using Nike's purchasing power to incentivize contracted factories to maintain a high ethical standard to applying sanctions when said standards are not met. And yes, admittedly, in a company as large as Nike and in a market as substantial and competitive as the athletic one, Nike really will never be perfect. However, the steps it is taking as a company to integrate sustainability and responsibility into its business plan are definitely in the right direction, and Nike cannot be faulted for the effort it has given. Now that we have delved a little bit deeper into the story of Nike and human rights, the larger question of corporate responsibility still looms. Do corporations have an obligation to alleviate social problems or not? As Steve Molloy puts it, shareholders don't hire CEOs to be the UN or act like a government or to be a charity. They were hired to make money for the shareholders. Business is society's wealth creation machine. Some may argue that by providing a necessary product or service at a reasonable price, a business is benefiting society. But, because of Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that does not give a business license to employ inhumane practices just to increase profit. Ultimately, I think a company like Nike does have an obligation, just like anyone else in the world, to treat its employees correctly for the given circumstances. I mean, as we very well know, factory workers in Cambodia will not get paid as much as those in the United States. However, I do not think that companies can be expected and forced to proactively work to alleviate social problems. After all, Nike is a business, and businesses are supposed to be focusing on making money. And though it is quite hard to tell how much progress has truly been made on improving working conditions or overtime hours, I think that Nike deserves some recognition for the amount of effort it has contributed to its corporate responsibility plan. I mean, heck, go look at the corporate responsibility report yourself. It literally never ends. Anyways, hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the history of Nike and corporate responsibility.